The morning mist hung thick over the Hurtgen forest on November 8, 1944, as Private First Class James Mitchell of the 101st Airborne Division settled into his concealed position 300 meters from the German defensive line. The dense evergreen canopy above filtered the pale autumn light into shifting patterns of shadow and illumination, creating a landscape where every tree trunk could hide an enemy and every sound carried the weight of potential danger. Mitchell had been trained in the swamps of Louisiana and the forests of North Carolina, but nothing in his 22 years of life had prepared him for the eerie stillness of this European woodland, where the air itself seemed to hold its breath before the next engagement. The German forces occupying these positions believed they held an impregnable defensive line, reinforced with concrete bunkers and overlapping fields of observation that made any Allied advance a costly proposition. They had no reason to suspect that their assumptions about warfare were about to be challenged by techniques developed thousands of miles away in the jungles of the Pacific Theater. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Mitchell would accomplish over the next 72 hours would not only dismantle an entire German defensive position, but would also introduce European theater commanders to camouflage methods that transformed how Allied forces approached asymmetric warfare in forested terrain. The story began 6 weeks earlier, when Sergeant Robert Chen, a veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign, arrived at the division training facility in England with a footlocker full of unusual equipment and a reputation for unconventional thinking. Chen had spent 18 months fighting in the Solomon Islands, where American forces learned hard lessons about jungle warfare from their Japanese adversaries. Among the techniques Chen brought back was a camouflage system that went far beyond the standard issue gear familiar to European theater troops. Chen stood before a skeptical audience of company commanders in a drafty Quonset hut on October 1st, displaying what looked like tattered vegetation sewn onto netting. Most of the officers dismissed it as impractical for the forests of France and Germany, too time-consuming to implement, too fragile for the wet European climate. But Lieutenant Colonel David Warren, commander of 2nd Battalion, saw something different. Warren had lost 43 men in the previous month to well-concealed German positions that picked off Allied soldiers before they could even identify the source of fire. Warren said to Chen after the briefing, "I do not care if it looks like something from a scarecrow. If it keeps my men alive and gives them an advantage, we are going to try it." Chen selected 12 soldiers for intensive training, and Mitchell was among them. Mitchell had grown up hunting white-tailed deer in the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia, and he possessed an intuitive understanding of how to move through forests without disturbing the natural patterns that alert prey to a predator's presence. What Chen taught went beyond anything Mitchell had learned from his father and grandfather. The camouflage system involved multiple layers of deception. First came the base layer, a suit made from dyed burlap that broke up the human silhouette. Then came the attachment of local vegetation, not randomly placed but strategically positioned to mimic the specific plant growth patterns of the surrounding environment. Chen emphasized that the vegetation had to be replaced daily as it wilted and changed color, maintaining perfect integration with the living forest. But the real innovation was in movement technique. Chen demonstrated how Japanese snipers in the Pacific had remained undetected meters from American positions, by moving only when wind disturbed the foliage, matching their motion to the natural movement of plants. He showed them how to use shadows and light patterns, how to position themselves so that even their breathing would not create visible movement, how to become part of the forest rather than an object within it. Mitchell absorbed these lessons with the intensity of someone who understood that his life would depend on their application. He spent hours studying the specific trees and undergrowth of different forest types, learning to differentiate between the oak and beech forests of lower elevations and the spruce and fir growth of higher terrain. He practiced the patience required to remain motionless for 6 to 8 hours, controlling his breathing, ignoring the cramping of muscles and the bite of insects. By early November, Warren had convinced Divisional Command to authorize a trial deployment. The Hurtgen Forest offered the perfect testing ground. The German defenders had established a defensive line anchored by a series of observation posts that covered the main approach routes. Allied intelligence estimated that each position held 4 to 6 soldiers equipped with precision rifles and excellent optics. These positions had already accounted for more than 100 Allied casualties over the previous 3 weeks. Mitchell volunteered to be the first to deploy the new tactics. On November 7th, he spent the entire day preparing his equipment. He collected fresh pine boughs, ferns, and moss from the exact area where he would operate. He tested each piece of vegetation to ensure it matched the color and texture of the surrounding growth. He checked and rechecked his rifle, a Springfield 1903 equipped with an 8-power scope, ensuring that every mechanism functioned smoothly and silently. That evening, Chen briefed Mitchell on his mission objectives. The primary goal was not to inflict maximum casualties, but to disrupt the German observation network and create uncertainty about their defensive security. Mitchell would operate independently, moving between positions over a 72-hour period, never staying in one location longer than necessary to complete his task. Chen said to Mitchell, "The Japanese taught us that the mind is the most important weapon in this type of warfare. Every time you succeed without being detected, the enemy begins to question everything they see and hear. That psychological pressure is worth more than the physical casualties you inflict." Mitchell moved into position during the pre-dawn darkness of November 8th. He had studied aerial reconnaissance photographs until he could visualize every contour of the terrain. His first position was in a cluster of dense spruce trees approximately 270 meters from the nearest German observation post. The approach took him 4 hours to cover 600 meters, moving only when wind masked the sound of his passage, freezing completely when the air went still. By first light, Mitchell had integrated himself into a position where he could observe 3 German defensive positions. He had woven fresh branches into his camouflage suit and positioned himself among the lower branches of a young spruce, his body contour merging with the irregular pattern of the tree. His face was covered with a veil of loose netting adorned with pine needles, breaking up the distinctive shape that the human face presents even in deep shadow. The German soldiers in the nearest observation post, approximately 300 meters to his front, maintained their routine with the confidence of men who believed themselves secure. Mitchell watched through his scope as they rotated watch positions, brewed coffee over a small stove, and scanned the forest approaches with their binoculars. He counted 6 men in that position, noting their weapons, their level of alertness, their patterns of movement. Mitchell waited. The fundamental principle Chen had drilled into him was that patience was not passive, but active, a state of complete awareness combined with absolute stillness. He observed the light patterns, how they changed as the sun climbed higher, where the shadows fell at different times of day, how the wind moved through different sections of the forest canopy. At 10:37 in the morning, conditions aligned. A gust of wind swept through the trees, causing widespread movement of branches and vegetation. The light at that moment created a dappled pattern that broke up clear outlines. A German soldier stood at the edge of the observation post, binoculars raised, scanning in a direction 45 degrees away from Mitchell's position. Mitchell's shot was fired during the height of the wind's passage through the canopy. The sound was partially masked by the rushing of wind through branches. The German soldier collapsed. Mitchell did not move. He had already planned his next action during the hours of observation. He slowly, incrementally, over the course of 3 minutes, shifted his position 15 degrees to his left, moving only during wind gusts, keeping his outline merged with the tree structure. The German position erupted into activity. Soldiers shouted to each other, trying to determine the direction of the threat. They fired several bursts in completely wrong directions, their shots guided by panic rather than tactical awareness. Mitchell remained absolutely motionless, controlling even his breathing to shallow, measured cycles that would not create visible movement of his camouflage. Over the next 6 hours, the German defenders searched for the threat. They sent out a patrol of 4 men who moved cautiously through the forest, examining likely hiding positions. The patrol passed within 40 meters of Mitchell's location, their eyes scanning the trees, but their visual search patterns trained to identify human shapes and military equipment failed to register the perfectly integrated camouflage that made Mitchell indistinguishable from the surrounding vegetation. After the patrol returned, reporting no contact, the German defenders settled into an increased state of alert. Mitchell noted their new defensive posture, the way they now kept at least 2 men scanning at all times, how they had repositioned their heavy weapon to cover a different approach angle. All of this information would be valuable to Allied commanders planning future operations. As dusk approached, Mitchell began his withdrawal. He moved even more carefully than during his insertion, knowing that the Germans would be hyper-alert to any sound or movement. The withdrawal took 5 hours to cover 400 meters to a rally point where Chen waited with food, water, and fresh camouflage materials. Chen listened to Mitchell's report, making notes about the German response patterns and the effectiveness of the camouflage technique. Then Chen said, "Tomorrow you will move to a different area. They will expect another attack on the same positions. We will violate that expectation." The second day, November 9th, Mitchell established his position 800 meters south of his previous location, targeting a different section of the German defensive line. This position covered a supply route that German forces used to rotate personnel and deliver provisions to forward positions. Mitchell's intelligence briefing had identified this as a critical vulnerability. The route ran through a narrow valley where dense forest on both sides limited alternative paths. Mitchell positioned himself on a slight elevation that gave him clear observation of a 200-meter stretch of the route. His camouflage this time incorporated the brown and gray tones of dormant ferns and the rough bark texture of the oak trees that dominated this section of forest. He had arrived at this position during the night, using a different approach route to avoid creating any pattern that German patrols might detect. At 07:15 hours, a German supply detail appeared on the route. 6 soldiers escorting a cart loaded with ammunition crates and food supplies. Mitchell observed them through his scope, noting their relaxed posture, the way they talked among themselves without maintaining proper tactical spacing or security awareness. These were rear echelon troops, not frontline combat soldiers, and their behavior reflected a belief that they were operating in secure territory. Mitchell faced a decision. His orders gave him discretion about targets and timing. The supply detail represented a legitimate military target, but engaging them would alert the entire German defensive network to the presence of a threat in this area. He chose to wait, allowing the detail to pass, instead focusing on the more significant objective of the defensive positions themselves. At 1100 hours, 2 German soldiers appeared, moving with the purposeful stride of men conducting a routine patrol. They stopped approximately 150 meters from Mitchell's position, consulting a map and discussing something that involved pointing toward different areas of the forest. Mitchell could hear fragments of their conversation carried on the wind, though he could not understand the German words. What happened next would become a defining moment in Mitchell's deployment. One of the German soldiers moved directly toward Mitchell's position, clearly intending to relieve himself behind the privacy of the large oak tree where Mitchell had concealed himself. The German approached to within 20 meters, close enough that Mitchell could see the details of his uniform, the stubble on his face, the wedding ring on his left hand. Mitchell remained frozen. The slightest movement, the smallest sound would betray his position at this range. The German soldier was young, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, and he showed none of the hard edges of extended combat service. He completed his business and returned to his companion, never realizing that he had come within meters of an enemy soldier. This close encounter reinforced for Mitchell the absolute effectiveness of the camouflage system when properly applied. It also reminded him that the men he was fighting were individuals with lives and families, not abstract enemies. This psychological complexity stayed with him throughout the mission, adding a layer of emotional weight to the technical execution of his tasks. Later that afternoon, Mitchell observed a changing of the guard at one of the observation posts. 3 fresh soldiers arrived to relieve the current watch. During the transition, when attention was focused on the handover procedures and the exchanging of information about observed activities, Mitchell took his opportunity. The shot was timed to coincide with the sound of a heavy truck engine laboring up a distant hill, the mechanical noise masking the report of the rifle. The reaction was immediate, but confused. The German soldiers could not determine the direction of the threat. They suspected that the shot might have come from Allied positions much farther away, a lucky long-range hit rather than a close-range precision attack. This misinterpretation worked in Mitchell's favor, directing their defensive response away from his actual position. Over the second day, Mitchell engaged 4 times, each shot carefully planned and executed, each withdrawal conducted with the same meticulous attention to camouflage and movement discipline that had characterized his entire operation. By the evening of November 9th, German commanders were beginning to recognize that they faced something beyond conventional partisan activity or long-range harassing fire. Intercepted radio communications, decoded by Allied intelligence, revealed the growing concern among German officers. One transmission described the attacks as the work of a ghost who strikes without warning and vanishes without trace. Another ordered the deployment of specialized counter-sniper teams equipped with advanced optics and trained in counter-insurgency tactics from the Eastern Front. On the third day, November 10th, Mitchell knew that the German response would be more sophisticated and more dangerous. Chen briefed him on the intelligence regarding counter-sniper teams and emphasized that Mitchell's survival now depended on being even more cautious, even more patient, even more perfectly integrated with the environment. Mitchell selected a position that violated conventional tactical wisdom. Instead of choosing elevated ground with clear sightlines, he positioned himself in a low depression where water had pooled during recent rains, creating a patch of marsh vegetation distinctly different from the surrounding forest. The discomfort of lying in cold, muddy water was significant, but the position offered something more valuable than comfort. It was a location that German tactical doctrine would dismiss as unsuitable for a sniper hide. From this position, Mitchell could observe a junction where 3 paths converged, a natural choke point that German patrols had to navigate. Throughout the morning, he watched several patrols pass, including 2 that showed the characteristics of specialized counter-sniper teams: heightened alertness, systematic scanning of likely hide positions, movement patterns designed to make long-range shooting difficult. At 1300 hours, Mitchell observed something that made him reconsider his entire approach. A German officer, accompanied by what appeared to be a senior non-commissioned officer, were conducting a detailed inspection of the defensive positions. The officer carried himself with the bearing of someone important, and the deference shown to him by other soldiers suggested high rank. Mitchell had a clear shot. The range was 220 meters, well within his capability. The weather conditions were favorable, with minimal wind and good visibility, but something made him hesitate. Chen's briefing had emphasized that the mission's value lay not just in the casualties inflicted, but in the disruption of German defensive confidence and the demonstration of new tactical capabilities. Mitchell made a decision that would later be recognized as tactically brilliant. Instead of engaging the officer, he waited until the inspection party moved to a position where Mitchell could observe their reaction to his next action. Then he engaged a different target, a soldier manning an observation post approximately 350 meters away, a shot that the German command group would witness but whose origin they would struggle to identify. The effect was exactly what Mitchell intended. The German officer and his party immediately took cover, their composure shattered by the demonstration that even in the middle of conducting an inspection with heavy security, they were vulnerable to an unseen threat. Mitchell observed through his scope as the officer shouted orders, as soldiers scattered to search for the shooter, as the entire carefully organized inspection dissolved into chaos. But Mitchell had made one small error. In shifting his position to observe the German reaction, he had disturbed a patch of marsh grass in a way that created a subtle but detectable pattern. One of the German counter-sniper specialists, a veteran of the Eastern Front where Soviet snipers had perfected similar techniques, noticed the disturbance. The German specialist did not immediately react. Instead, he carefully studied the area, looking for the additional signs that would confirm his suspicion. Mitchell saw the German's attention focus on his general area and realized his situation had become critically dangerous. The slightest additional movement would confirm his position. Remaining still gave him a chance, however small, that the German would dismiss the disturbance as natural. For 43 minutes, Mitchell remained absolutely motionless, while the German specialist studied his hiding place. The physical strain was immense. Lying in cold water, maintaining a posture that allowed no movement whatsoever, controlling his breathing to eliminate any visible disturbance of the vegetation around him. But more challenging was the psychological pressure of knowing that trained eyes were searching for him, that his life depended on the perfection of his camouflage integration. Finally, the German specialist turned away. Whether he dismissed his suspicion or filed it away as insufficient evidence, Mitchell never knew. But the threat had passed for the moment. Mitchell waited another 2 hours before beginning his withdrawal, moving with even greater caution than before, taking 8 hours to cover the 700 meters back to the rally point. When he finally reached Chen, Mitchell was exhausted, hypothermic from the prolonged exposure to cold water, and psychologically drained from the intensity of the near discovery. Chen immediately wrapped him in blankets and provided hot coffee laced with sugar for energy. But before allowing Mitchell to rest, Chen debriefed him on every detail of the encounter with the German counter-sniper specialist. Chen said with obvious concern in his voice, "You have pushed the technique to its absolute limit. The Germans now know someone is operating in ways they have never encountered in this theater. They will adapt. The question is whether we can stay ahead of that adaptation." Mitchell's 72-hour deployment had achieved remarkable results. Allied intelligence confirmed that the German defensive line in that sector had been disrupted, with units pulled back from forward positions to more secure areas, patrol patterns altered to avoid predictable routes, and significant resources diverted to counter-sniper operations. The psychological impact was even more significant. German soldiers in that sector reported feeling constantly observed, unable to relax even in positions previously considered secure. The after-action analysis revealed that Mitchell had engaged successfully on 17 separate occasions over the 3 days, with each engagement planned and executed with the precision that made counteraction nearly impossible. But the number 17 did not capture the full scope of the disruption. Intelligence estimates suggested that German defensive effectiveness in that sector had been reduced by approximately 30% due to the changes in deployment and the psychological impact on troops. What made Mitchell's accomplishment particularly significant was that it occurred not through overwhelming firepower or numerical superiority, but through the intelligent application of technique and the patient exploitation of environmental factors. This represented a different model of warfare, one that emphasized stealth, integration with terrain, and psychological warfare over direct confrontation. The lessons learned from Mitchell's deployment were rapidly disseminated throughout Allied forces operating in forested terrain. Training programs were established to teach the jungle camouflage techniques that Chen had brought from the Pacific Theater. Equipment was modified to better support this type of operation. Tactical doctrine was updated to incorporate the principles of asymmetric engagement that Mitchell had demonstrated so effectively. But perhaps the most important impact was on the German defenders themselves. Intercepted communications from the weeks following Mitchell's operation revealed a fundamental shift in how German forces perceived the security of forested positions. Orders were issued requiring constant counter-sniper vigilance, prohibiting predictable patrol patterns, and mandating frequent repositioning of observation posts. These measures consumed resources and created operational friction that degraded overall defensive effectiveness. The German counterintelligence analysis of the attacks initially attributed them to a team of multiple snipers, refusing to believe that a single soldier could have achieved such results. When they finally accepted that they had likely faced a single operator, the psychological impact was even more profound. If one Allied soldier using these techniques could create such disruption, what would happen when these methods were deployed at scale? Mitchell himself was quietly awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions, though the specific details of his operation remained classified for many years. He would continue to operate using these techniques throughout the remainder of the war, training other soldiers and refining the methods that had proven so effective. But he never again experienced the same level of psychological intensity as those first 72 hours in the Hurtgen forest, when he had pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in individual combat operations. The broader strategic impact of Mitchell's deployment and the subsequent adoption of jungle camouflage techniques by Allied forces contributed to a shift in the tactical balance in forested terrain throughout the European theatre. German forces, which had previously enjoyed significant advantages in defensive operations through the use of well-prepared positions and excellent optics, found themselves vulnerable to a form of warfare that negated many of their traditional strengths. The techniques that Chen brought from the Pacific and that Mitchell proved effective in Europe represented a synthesis of lessons learned across multiple theaters of war. Japanese forces had developed sophisticated camouflage and infiltration methods through years of jungle warfare. American forces had learned and adapted these techniques through hard experience in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. The transfer of this knowledge to the European theater demonstrated the value of cross-theater learning and the importance of remaining adaptable in the face of changing tactical situations. For the German defenders in the Hürtgen forest, the appearance of an enemy who could operate invisibly within their defensive perimeter represented a fundamental challenge to their understanding of warfare. They had prepared for frontal assaults, for artillery bombardments, for armored attacks. They had not prepared for an enemy who could move through their positions like a ghost, striking without warning and disappearing without trace. The psychological dimension of Mitchell's operation deserves particular attention. Modern warfare studies have documented the significant impact that invisible threats have on soldier morale and combat effectiveness. When soldiers cannot identify or counter a threat, when they feel constantly observed and vulnerable, even in supposedly secure areas, the psychological strain accumulates rapidly. This psychological attrition can be as significant as physical casualties in degrading a unit's combat capability. Mitchell's operation demonstrated that technological superiority and numerical advantage, while important, could be countered by superior technique and the intelligent exploitation of environmental factors. The German forces in that sector had better fortifications, more soldiers, and well-established defensive positions. But these advantages became liabilities when faced with an enemy who operated according to different principles, who valued invisibility over firepower, patience over aggression, integration with environment over domination of terrain. The story of Mitchell's deployment also highlights the importance of individual skill and initiative in warfare. While modern military operations emphasize combined arms coordination and large-scale logistics, there remain situations where a single highly trained individual can have a disproportionate impact on operational outcomes. Mitchell's success depended not just on the techniques he had learned, but on his personal qualities. His patience, his attention to detail, his ability to remain calm under extreme psychological pressure, his willingness to spend hours in uncomfortable positions waiting for the right moment. The evolution of camouflage techniques from the Pacific theater to the European forests represents a fascinating case study in how military knowledge transfers across different environments. The principles remained constant: the ability to break up human outline, to match local vegetation patterns, to move in harmony with natural environmental movements, but the application required adaptation to different plant species, different light conditions, different tactical situations. Chen's role in this story deserves recognition. As a soldier who had survived the brutal combat of the Pacific Islands, he had learned lessons written in the blood of his comrades. His willingness to share this knowledge, to advocate for techniques that seemed unusual to European theater veterans, to personally train soldiers like Mitchell, made the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Without Chen's persistence in the face of skepticism, the techniques that proved so effective might never have been deployed in the European theater. The German response to Mitchell's operation also reveals important aspects of how military organizations adapt to new threats. Initial responses were characterized by disbelief and attempts to fit the attacks into existing tactical frameworks. Only gradually did German commanders accept that they faced a genuinely new form of threat requiring new countermeasures. This delay in recognition and adaptation gave Allied forces time to exploit the techniques more widely before effective countermeasures could be developed and deployed. Looking at the broader historical context, Mitchell's deployment in November 1944 occurred during a period when the overall strategic situation was shifting decisively against German forces. The psychological impact of operations like Mitchell's, combined with material shortages, declining troop quality, and increasing Allied pressure on all fronts, contributed to a cumulative degradation of German defensive capabilities. While no single operation determined the outcome of the war, the accumulation of tactical innovations like the jungle camouflage techniques helped accelerate the Allied advance and reduce casualties in the process. The story also raises interesting questions about the ethics and psychology of this type of warfare. Mitchell spent hours observing German soldiers before engaging, seeing them as individuals with personal characteristics and behaviors. The close encounter with the young German soldier, who unknowingly approached within meters of his position, created a moment of profound human connection across the barrier of war. These experiences had lasting psychological effects on soldiers who operated in this manner, creating a form of intimate combat that was different from the impersonal violence of artillery or aerial bombardment. For soldiers like Mitchell, the transition back to civilian life after the war carried unique challenges. The skills that made him effective in combat, the ability to remain motionless for hours, the constant awareness of surroundings, the heightened state of alertness, did not simply disappear when the war ended. Many soldiers who operated in similar roles reported difficulty adjusting to the normalcy of peacetime existence, finding civilian life almost unbearably mundane after the intensity of combat operations. The technical aspects of Mitchell's equipment also merit consideration. The Springfield rifle he used was not the most advanced weapon available, but it was reliable, accurate, and well suited to the precision shooting required for this type of operation. The scope, while only 8-power magnification by modern standards, was sufficient for the ranges at which he engaged. The emphasis on reliability over technological sophistication reflected a practical understanding that in field conditions, simpler equipment properly maintained often outperformed more complex systems that could fail under adverse conditions. The impact of Mitchell's operation extended beyond immediate tactical results. The successful demonstration of jungle camouflage techniques in European forests led to changes in training programs, equipment procurement, and tactical doctrine that affected how Allied forces operated for the remainder of the war. The principles he validated, that proper camouflage and patient fieldcraft could neutralize significant enemy advantages, influenced military thinking well into the post-war period, and contributed to the development of specialized reconnaissance and sniper programs in subsequent decades. Perhaps most significantly, Mitchell's story illustrates how warfare continually evolves through the interaction of technology, technique, and human ingenuity. The camouflage methods that proved so effective in the forests of France and Germany had their origins in observations of how indigenous peoples in the Pacific moved through jungle environments, filtered through the experience of soldiers fighting in the Solomon Islands, adapted by innovators like Chen, and perfected through the skill and courage of soldiers like Mitchell. This chain of learning and adaptation represents the human dimension of military history that often gets lost in discussions of strategy and technology. The 72 hours that Mitchell spent in the Hurtgen forest demonstrated that even in the mechanized industrial warfare of the 20th century, there remained a place for individual skill, for the patient application of technique, for the intelligent exploitation of environmental factors. His success did not come from superior weapons or overwhelming force, but from better integration with the terrain, from deeper understanding of how to move unseen, from the discipline to wait for exactly the right moment before acting. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.